Good afternoon from Singapore. My name is Aisha Al-Sarihi. I am a research fellow at the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore, and I have the great pleasure to be moderating today's session titled the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Nuclear Power. Today, and welcome to everyone joining us today. Today I'm joined by three specialists on nuclear energy, and we are going to discuss this timely topic about the nuclear. As we know, nuclear is coming at the forefront of global discussion. Geopolitical events and the disruption of the energy supplies, for example, the Russia-Ukraine war, the ongoing war in Gaza. These are putting the global energy security at the forefront of the global discussion. Also, on climate change front, the urgency to tackle climate change and reduce the impacts of it, and the carbon clock is, it's ticking. So that is also one of the reasons we see the nuclear is coming as a solution to reach net zero goals by 2050. Last year in the COP28 in the UAE, we saw a signatory of 22 nations aiming to triple down the nuclear power by 2050. So today we will try to discuss many aspects of the nuclear energy, including why nuclear is, why are we turning to nuclear despite the previous concerns around the safety and the security of the nuclear, why there are changes in perceptions toward nuclear. We will try to zoom in on the Gulf and in the Southeast Asia. We will also try to answer the question, is nuclear really a solution to the energy security? And what are, or where we stand today on the safeguards needed to ensure the nuclear safety and security. And to answer those questions and many more in this webinar, I'm joined by three esteemed speakers. First of all, let me introduce Dr. Victor Nian, who is joining us from China at the moment. Dr. Victor is the co-founder and the CEO of the Center for Strategic Energy and Resources. His vision for the CSER is to foster the development of clean energy ecosystems for empowering and accelerating the energy transition efforts in an equitable manner across countries and regions in the world. Before establishing the CSER, Dr. Nian, as an aspiring entrepreneurial individual, he served in various capacities, including setting up and leading virtual centers of excellence, energy, carbon resulting business, and expert networks. He earned his PhD and BNG from the National University of Singapore and was one of the first scholars from the NUS to publish independent studies in academic journals on nuclear energy-related topics. So welcome, Dr. Victor. I'm also joined from Bahrain, I believe. Yes, I'm joined by Amna Ibrahim, who is a research analyst at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS, the Middle East office. Amna is specializing in nuclear energy policies of the Gulf states. Her expertise include Gulf energy policy, nuclear security, and non-proliferation dynamics in the region and the Gulf regional security. Amna previously worked and attended training at multiple U.S. national labs, including Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee, Brookhaven National Laboratory in New York, and Sunday National Laboratory in New Mexico. She is a member of the Middle East Next Generation of Arms Control Specialists, a program of James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies at the Midbury Institute for International Studies at Monterey. Welcome, Amna. The third speaker for today is Ludovica Castelli, who is joining from Italy, I believe. Ludovica is a doctoral researcher at the University of Leicester within the Third Nuclear Age Project funded by the European Research Council. Her research focuses on history of the nuclear domino metaphor, particularly in relation of the Middle East. Her main research interest within which she studies disruptive practices and nuclear politics are international relation theory, nuclear studies, US foreign policy, and Middle East nuclear politics. She published the first co-author peer-reviewed article titled Justifying Attacks Against Nuclear Facilities. She is now working on a second peer-reviewed article that's under review with the Middle East studies, again also on the Villa in the Jungle nuclear paradigm, Israel nuclear politics, and changing regional security complex. So welcome to you, Ludovica, and welcome to all the three speakers. Before we start the discussion in the webinar today, I just would like to advise all the attendees, if you have any questions, you can type your question in the Q&A function, and then we will try to answer those questions after we go into a round of discussion between the three speakers. So with that, I would like first to start with Dr. Victor. Again, on the question, why are we turning to nuclear? So we know that in Southeast Asia, we see Singapore, for example, announced in the parliament in 2012 that it will not pursue any nuclear power. But today we see Singapore is exploring nuclear power. We see also other Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam, Philippines, and Indonesia are expediting plans to build nuclear plants after really halting those plans in the past. So very simple question, why we see this turn to nuclear in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, well, thank you, Aisha, for having me in this webinar, and also, of course, my appreciation to the Middle East Institute for this opportunity. Well, Southeast Asia is always an interesting topic when it comes to energy, right? So before even we talk about nuclear, there is even people talking about the, a interesting counter argument. They say that the argument is, we never really have an energy issue. There's an abundance of fossil fuel, and right now, although there's a prediction that we may become a net energy importer by 2035, the fact is still we are, as a region, we are still exporting energy. We're still exporting gas, and also, of course, now with the increasing energy demand, there is a lot of coal and we can use. So in terms of sustaining economic development, in terms of having sufficient access to energy that powers the social development, sustainable development in certain extent, we don't really have an energy issue as a region. But of course, different countries have different circumstances. Certain countries have access or being blessed with renewable energy. For example, Laos, Malaysia, they have hydropower, which is great, in terms of supplying volumetric amount of green electricity. But countries like Singapore and many part of other places there, we don't really have access to that kind of renewable energy resources. At the same time, our energy demand is growing. There is high intensity in terms of energy, heavy manufacturing energy demand, and also the carbon intensity is not reducing in most part of Southeast Asia. So when climate change kick into effect, and then we started worrying about what we could do in terms of mitigating the warming climate, then that's where the alternative energy comes into discussion. So before Fukushima happened, countries have, collectively recognized that nuclear is probably one of the best, if not the option, to diversify from fossil fuel, because this is controllable energy and you can have reliable 24/7 energy generation. Let's not talk about carbon emission for a second, just to speak about reliable, reasonably affordable and continuous supply of energy that we can control and we can continuously put onto the grid without having too much challenge like intermittency that we're talking about today. So nuclear energy seems to be an alternative to fossil fuel, and we wanted to pursue that. And also nuclear energy provides a way of diversifying from fossil fuel, in a way addressing energy security in countries where they may, in the long term, face a shortage of fuel supply or may already be importing, fossil energy. For example, the Philippines is already importing a lot of coal, to satisfy power demand, and hence electricity price is really high in that country. Singapore, another example, importing 100% of its gas use, and 97% of gas goes to power. So there is a need to diversify this. And in comparison, because the energy density of nuclear is so high, and you always enter into a government-to-government kind of relationship when it comes to fuel procurement. So in a way, you may be able to secure reasonable supply of fuel as compared to fossil fuel, and also at a reasonable price. And so from an energy security point of view, and a trade bilateral relationship, nuclear energy seems to be a good option for everyone. That changed, but when Fukushima came, everything changed. So in the eyes of the public, nuclear energy is simply uncontrollable. Yes, you can provide 24/7 electricity, but in the eyes of the public, something big could happen, just like Fukushima. If there is an accident, like earthquake, like what we have in the region, where we have a lot of earthquakes, we also have countries sitting along the Pacific Ring of Fire, and there's volcanic activities. But still, there's also a risk of tsunami, right? So when those things come to a nuclear power plant, only thing will happen is a disaster. And because the Southeast Asian countries are also sitting very close to one another, if one accident happened in one place, well, at least based on our assessment, most of the neighborhood is going to get radioactive cloud, right? Depending on when the trust wind is blowing, at the time of the year. So if you're looking at the annual scale, yes, everybody get a fair share of radioactive radiation if there's a major accident. And so from the perspective of public acceptance, this is simply not acceptable. And nobody wants to raise their political capital in pushing for a nuclear agenda right after Fukushima. And so basically everybody put a handbrake on the development and says, okay, right now the technology isn't ready. This I was referring 2010, right? The large reactors. We probably can't really do that. There's a lot of issues and lessons learned. We need to figure out from Japan what causes it, how to mitigate it, how to prevent it before we can make an informed decision. And of course, at that time, there was also a fossil lobbying to say that, well, if there is coal underground, there is gas that we can tap into, and there is oil in the region. Why don't we continue with what we are familiar with rather than disrupting the economic development trajectory? And of course, not so far after Fukushima, there was also a huge renewable lobbying in the region to say that, okay, although we think that solar energy was expensive, the cost of it has dropped drastically over the years, especially panels in China, where I'm sitting, right? They're saying that, well, if you have cheap access to solar panel, potentially cheap access to wind power, this you're talking about the Gulf, out on the outside of Vietnam and the Philippines, the offshore wind, where we do have some resources available. And plus the fact that the energy storage cost is also going down. Why don't we go renewable? What's the point of investing in nuclear energy and worry about all these issues of accident? And don't forget about the radioactive waste management, spent fuel, and the burden of proliferation, right? Yes, there is the ability to address energy security, but we don't want to raise our political capital. And so that was the sentiment. Even today, if you go around Southeast Asian countries and you raise this issue about nuclear energy, I would say that majority of the people, the reaction you think you're going to get is, well, okay, we can have a conversation about it, but you ask me whether I'm going to support it, the answer is simply no. So this is the public sentiment that is still preventing nuclear energy development in Southeast Asia. But then again, if you're looking into the industry, you look into the government, or anybody that is reasonably informed in energy development, not just nuclear, but reasonably informed in energy development, they will be able to rationalize the risks, cost, and benefit of nuclear energy. And they would, the people understand that there is a need, fundamental need of having nuclear energy in the region. This is not just about mitigating climate change. Yes, decarbonization is very important to have, but the other important part is, for example, capacity building, training people, right? Technology development, industrial supply chain development. More importantly, Southeast Asia being now the center of the global geopolitical dynamics in terms of trade, in terms of partnership. then nuclear energy could also be, an angle in which there is, increasing exchange of supplies, materials, diplomatic relationship, all on that front. So informed people would understand that there is a need for nuclear energy. But the challenge is, how would these informed group of people convince the public that nuclear energy is the way to go, right? And of course, turning to Singapore, still sheer majority of the populations are against nuclear. And this is not just about concerns over Fukushima. There is also the issue about the lack of understanding of nuclear technology, how it works, and how it can address the country's energy security going forward, and what is in it for the country to go nuclear, basically. And the same thing goes for everyone else. Even in countries where, it's, for example, let's say Philippines. Right now, the electricity price is high. Of course, don't convert it to US dollar or convert it to Singapore dollar. Just look into the national circumstances and the appropriate electricity that people needs to pay. The people are not paying the right price. So the question is, if nuclear energy can play a role, then what is really the public support over there? Are the people willing to support nuclear energy? The answer is also probably not 100%. So this is really what is really preventing a large-scale rapid deployment of nuclear energy in the region at the moment. Do we have technologies? Yes, we might. Some of these Generation 4 advanced reactors are being developed, but it takes time.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Victor. There is a lot to digest in what you have said, but I can see that there is a gap between the government decisions and really the public perceptions about the nuclear. There is the view that the nuclear is good for energy security and for decarbonization, but then the public support is still not there. And I will come back to you later to really try to debunk that further. I want to move to Amna. Amna, I would like also to look at how, whether the Gulf have different reasons to go for nuclear. Again, the Gulf countries, are having huge resources of the oil and gas as well as renewable energy. But then most recently in the Gulf and also in the wider region, in the Middle East, we see more countries are getting more interested in nuclear. At least 8 countries in the region has, expressed interest to build a nuclear power plants. At the moment, the only operational nuclear plants are in the UAE, the Baraka, and then in Iran, Bushehr. But also now we see Saudi Arabia also is interested in nuclear. And it is viewed that the nuclear is central to the discussion between Saudi Arabia and the US in the security deal that's expected to be completed soon. So I'll leave it to you, Amna, to explain why we see an increasing interest in the Gulf. What are the reasons behind going to nuclear?
Thank you, Aisha. All right, so I'm going to start with going over the reasons why Gulf states are looking at nuclear, and then I'll address some of the issues that Victor is speaking about in terms of how do those relate to the Gulf. What is Gulf perception of nuclear in terms of the state and in terms of the public? I think that's an interesting thing to talk about as well. All right, so when it comes to nuclear policy in the Gulf, especially in terms of civilian nuclear programs, when it comes to the Arab states is what I'll be focusing on. It really comes down to electricity. The idea is to secure electricity while offsetting the fiscal cost of subsidized oil for electricity. So as net energy exporters, and in order to maintain their position as net energy exporters, it's important for them to do 2 things. First, to secure the supply of what they do have today, oil and gas, which means not wasting it on very high domestic consumption. And the Gulf states have very high domestic consumption. And then second of all is to then also expand your energy portfolio. So you could be an energy exporter of multiple different types of energy. So we also see hydrogen projects, we see, electricity connectivity projects. There's a lot of other energy partnerships that we're seeing Gulf states want to pursue as well. most of those new energy types also rely on electricity. So again, it goes back to electricity, where you need electricity residential and, you know, commercial, like domestically, but you also need electricity for your industrial sector to expand, and you need electricity for your new energy partnerships. Hydrogen relies on electrolysis. And again, when it comes to carbon capture, that's extremely electricity intensive. So they really need to raise the amount of domestic electricity they have access to. And when it comes to nuclear, when you compare that with any other type of low carbon technology, the difference isn't about, you know, this is the most low cost. It is a very reasonable cost because the costs are upfront. And then you basically end up dividing those by their lifetime, which is 80 years. Which, you know, when it comes to a solar plant or not, those have smaller lifetimes. And so that cost per wattage is different. But other renewables, I mean, solar and wind and all, they still do, especially solar, does have a oftentimes lower cost per wattage than nuclear, but that's always changing. The thing with nuclear is that it's the baseline electricity provider. That's why states are viewing it as the option. So when you need 20% of your energy portfolio secured because you're expanding different sectors, you have to go to nuclear because solar can't do that as a baseline load. There are intermittency issues with all the other ones. So even when you look at, you know, energy economic models like Lazarus and stuff, they actually, them as well, they separate nuclear from the others, because when it comes to nuclear, it's the only low carbon source that is able to provide baseline capacity. So that's really the goal there. And that's what we see the UAE did. So the UAE had built 4 units. They're all operational at this point in time. It's about over 20% of their energy portfolio now. The site is licensed for 4 more units. They've already announced exploring the idea of expanding that and building more units at that site. And that, you know, if they were to do that, I mean, they don't need to do that. You don't need to have 50% of your energy portfolio be nuclear. But if they were to do that, it would really allow them to be leaders in the electricity connectivity projects that are underway, in hydrogen exports, in carbon capture research. It would really allow them to do a lot of other things. And, you know, the development of these states, especially with them being very outward looking, right? Wanting to be connectors and wanting to maintain their position as energy leaders. Those things are important for their survival in the future. So to me, that is the gist of it. When it comes to nuclear, there's also desalination. So remember, all of the states are water scarce. So just to throw a figure out here to, you know, really accurately describe how water scarce they are, over half of the globally installed desalination capacity in the Middle East is in the Middle East. That's followed by the European Union and the US. So for example, in the GCC, the average per capita is 500 liters per GCC citizen. In Germany, it's 100. So it's 5 times more water consumption than Germany. It's really a very intense, you know, water desalination need, and nuclear has that water desalination application. You know, nuclear has steam applications, heat applications that can all be transferred to your industrial sector. And that's what I think Saudi Arabia is eyeing at the moment. So Saudi Arabia is going to install 2 units in Duwayhin, which is on the Arab Gulf as well. And both of those units have to be pressurized water reactors. I think they've settled on pressurized water reactors. And it's a very, very safe bet. So pressurized water reactors are what the UAE installed. They installed 4 Korean pressurized water reactors. So Saudi Arabia has not gone the Korean route yet. They haven't announced who they're going to give the sites to, who the operator will be. But they have decided on pressurized water reactors, which really is a signal of like they're not trying new technologies, they're not trying, SMRs, they're not trying microreactors, they're not trying any kind of new nuclear technologies. But the site is, really something that can be used for industrial sector applications, because Saudi Arabia's industrial sector is on the east. It's not on the west. There's a lot of development going on in the west. And probably, my suspicion is they make sure they have the successful case, and then we'll probably end up seeing nuclear reactors on the Red Sea, far away in the future, but we probably will. But right now, this kind of industrial sector, to me, it's clear that they want it for industrial applications, and they want to kind of build their capacity in nuclear on all fronts: research, medical isotopes, and industrial applications. So there's a very serious economic need there that I don't want people to take lightly, because I know there's a lot of misconceptions about hedging and things like that, but you can't hedge with 2 units of pressurized water reactors. That's really not a way that anyone would tell you to hedge. And then when it comes to some other Arab countries, I'll just touch on really quickly. Egypt is also building reactors. They're partnered with Rosatom, and they've been under construction for a while now. So they've actually been dealing with a lot of delays. Rosatom is a very large provider of nuclear. It's Russian, of course. And we don't know, I don't want to make assumptions, but to me, it seems like any large provider is going to suffer delays because they're building in so many different places. So there's a kind of supply chain issue probably, or something. But also the very strange thing to me about Egypt plant and the one in Turkey as well, because pretty much the same deal, the one in Turkey at Akoyo, is that these are build, own, and operate models, which means that Rosatom owns the sites as well. So usually the operator will build, operate, and then transfer to the host country or to the host operator eventually. That's what's happening, for example, in the UAE. And that's probably what will happen in Saudi Arabia once they assign a bidder. However, with Egypt and Turkey, Rosatom owns it. So one part of that is the financing issue. So they're doing 95% of the financing is Rosatom. And so I guess that means the state has to buy back the electricity. And to me, that comes across as very economically inefficient. The nuclear is already extremely expensive. To then pay off a 30 billion or 25 billion debt, and then also buy the electricity from the operator because you don't own it. It's I don't see when they're going to not pay for electricity then. At the same time, if you're making an 80-year bet, because that's the lifetime of nuclear, it seems like there's either a hope that in the Egypt case that a Gulf country will bail them out, or that it'll be okay. It'll be, electricity secured at an expensive cost for 30 years or 40 years, but then you get, 40 years of cheap electricity in the long run. So that would be a very long-term strategic thinking, which I don't know, which you have to make when you're planning nuclear. But to me, those are really the problematic scenarios in nuclear, is the modeling, the kind of pay model, the financing models that happen. I think those are very difficult to justify to a public audience.
Thank you very much, Amna. I think you highlighted in too many factors that we can think of. Already there is a question to you on the chat box, but I will ask you later on. I can see that Amna highlighted an additional reasons behind nuclear in the Gulf. In common, the energy security decarbonizations are some of the reasons for decarbonization for the nuclear, same as Southeast Asia. but I can hear combating climate change also, the water security and the desalination is also another reason. However, so it seems energy security is the repeated theme here for nuclear. So I want to move to Ludovica. I want to ask you the question, is like really nuclear the solution for the energy security? We know that nuclear reserves, the processing and of the nuclear and the supply chain of nuclear is concentrated in a few countries worldwide. And you are speaking from Europe. We know, for example, the European countries want to phase out the dependence on Russia gas, and we can see that because of this energy security issues that emerged recently, the European countries are turning to nuclear at the moment. However, looking closely at those nuclear plants, we see that most of them are supplied by the Soviet Union. So the question is, are we seeing a paradox between nuclear as an energy security solution and the conflicts that are going on, giving the, again, the dependency on the nuclear supply chains?
Thanks, Aisha, and thanks to the Middle East Institute for the kind invitation. Thanks also to Amna and Victor for giving us an insightful overview of this region's approaches, different approaches towards nuclear. I think what is quite clear is that the interest in nuclear power is growing among countries. I'm always a bit skeptical about those phrases like, nuclear renaissance or nuclear fever, because interest in nuclear has always been, a bit unstable, has always been, a bit up and down, as Victor also said, because it has an intrinsic strong vulnerability to exogenous events. Victor talked about Fukushima and its strong impact in Southeast Asia. We've seen a bit of the same situation today with the invasion of Ukraine and the attacks on Zaporizhzhia. Of course, the impact is mostly on Europe. So there certainly is an interest. I think for the region I know better among the two, which is the Middle East, apart from the UAE, I think we're still not seeing such a tangible follow-up in terms of the practical steps. There is a lot of interest. There is, for all the obvious reasons that Amna mentioned, which are of course very, 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 very real and tangible. I think a simple explanation that also Amna mentioned is that the acquisition process inherent in a civil nuclear program is extremely complex. But I think I would also add that it's a very fragile process because of its political dimension. So, I mean, each country has, as we know, the right under Article 4 of the NPT to choose whether to develop a domestic nuclear fuel cycle capability or whether to rely on external nuclear suppliers. So this is a matter of, it's just a different choice. And this is for, of course, the provision of nuclear material and equipment. Now, we know that small indigenous enrichment programs like, the ones that Brazil or Japan have are way more uneconomical compared to major suppliers of enrichment services, such as, Urenco, which is a British, German, Dutch company, or Russia or China or South Korea now, which is very, active in the Gulf. But choosing to rely on nuclear suppliers can also be problematic because, of course, I mean, these countries can be very different, and of course, it's a political decision. Well, first of all, it also means giving up to a sovereign and independent program. So this is an element that for some countries can be very important, very relevant. We have seen this with Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, the Saudi policy, as Saudi policy elites have expressed a strong and seemingly non-negotiable interest in developing the capacity to produce low-enriched uranium as nuclear fuel, utilizing domestic resources. So in other words, nuclear fuel cycle independence. What does it mean? I mean, it can mean a lot of, it can entail a lot of elements. It can be a matter of prestige. It can be a matter of status. It can enhance regime legitimacy at home, but also it can be projecting power externally. It can be some of these elements, perhaps all of them. Each country has its own perception and an understanding of what nuclear power can add, to their country, besides, of course, the element of the very economic element that nuclear power can be. Different examples are Bahrain and the UAE. They have indicated, for example, their intention to forgo enrichment and reprocessing technologies and purchase, the nuclear fuel on the international market. So, for example, the UAE in their white paper on its nuclear energy plans explained that their decision was based on the economic infeasibility. I think it was specifically phrased like that. And in case of Bahrain, it was very similar in terms, it was also a matter of, they recognized that it was simply uneconomical for them. And then, of course, the second reason why relying on a nuclear supply can be problematic is that, of course, it can be, as I said before, very frangible. So we've seen in Europe the consequences of the invasion of Ukraine and the war and the following war. The implications on European reliance on Russia's gas and oil. This is just another situation in which geopolitical events have proved to have strong impact on, nuclear cooperation agreements. I think Amna said something about Egypt and Rosatom. I mean, they also had some issues. But in Europe, it was a very, very tangible, it was not about nuclear, it was about gas and oil. But of course, I mean, the logic is the same. So that this can be, partnerships can change, alliances can evolve, and of course, war happen. So, and this can have a strong impact on the supply chain. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Ludovica. I want to now move to another really themes that is important when it comes to nuclear is the security, the national security of the nuclear. So one of the criticism around the nuclear that the civil nuclear programs can be a first step towards like militarizing the nuclear resources. So this is a real concern. So I want to ask, because we see there's an interest in nuclear, so how from the Gulf and from South Asia perspective, how the governments in these countries are trying to address these challenges? Maybe we go to Amna first and then Victor.
Thanks, Aisha. So Ludovica did mention that the UAE forwent enrichment. Bahrain will probably also, yes, do the same if it decides to adopt SMRs in the future. So we definitely, when it comes to proliferation, there are multiple factors. First, the Gulf states are all signatories to the NPT. They are not all signatories or have ratified the additional protocol, but that's not mandatory. And then there's also the difference in terms of the safeguards that the IAEA has are not the safeguards that the US has. So the US NRC and the US says Congress have their own threshold, which is a very high threshold, where they cannot transfer US nuclear technology unless the recipient country completely forgoes enrichment itself. So that's not always been the case as well, is important to note. But they've really dug their heels into this in the past few years. Is no transfer of US technology to a newcomer state, especially a newcomer state, without that state decided that they're not going to do any enrichment. Because the proliferation aspect, usually when we say, weapons, the proliferation aspect really is determined by the know-how and capacity to develop, whether it's plutonium or uranium material. That's the American kind of standard. However, when it comes to the IAEA and the NPT, you are allowed to have a fuel cycle. You just need to make sure that verification and safeguards happen. So you needed a comprehensive safeguards agreement with the IAEA that includes verification and monitoring of those activities as well. Now, if you sign the additional protocol, you also then have to declare sites. Whereas if you don't sign the additional protocol, you're actually not forced to declare all your sites, because some of them could be, for example, a military site, and you wouldn't have to declare that. So there are differentiations. And there's also a differentiation as well when it comes to the Iran agreement. So the situation that Iran is in, because of the JCPOA, also imposed different standards on Iran in terms of verification and monitoring, not in terms of what they're allowed or not allowed to do, that are different than if there wasn't a JCPOA. When the Gulf states look at what Iran got, so Iran was allowed to continue enrichment and to continue fuel cycle development. They have different opinions. So no one likes this in the Gulf, that Iran is allowed to do this, but they also recognize that it's an international right to do it. They really just don't like that the US is allowing Iran to do it, because that's not the US standard. So for the UAE to access US technology, it had to waive its right to enrichment. And for Saudi Arabia to access US technology, it probably will have to waive its right to enrichment, which it won't do. So then the difference is, why does Iran get to? Well, first of all, Iran didn't, get US technology. So it's not really, the US isn't really making an exception there. But second of all, then they have very different response strategies. So even though their threat perception of Iran is the same, they have very different response strategies. The UAE wants to have an internationalized program. This is the way the UAE does everything. When you look at their investments abroad and all other sectors, the UAE does a lot, and it does it with international partners. So they wanted to have this electricity, they wanted to have it fast, and so they relied on the international community to give it to them. When it comes to Saudi Arabia is very focused on its vision plan that, is dependent on Saudi Arabia developing its domestic capacities on all fronts. So it's broadening its economic sectors, it's building human capacity in its economic sectors, and it includes its industries, it includes tourism, and it includes its minerals. They just came out with their minerals and industries strategy last year. Minerals is a big part of that. And for them, we're the world's supplier of fossil fuels. That is a mineral. Why are we not going to develop the rest of our minerals, especially if we have the geology for it? That's under a question mark, but if we have the geology for it, and stay ahead of the trend and these kind of critical minerals and other minerals aspects. So therefore, uranium ends up becoming a natural thing to not let go of. It also sees itself as the regional power. There is a geopolitical element here that, I'm not trying to avoid. And that means, not relying on your energy from someone else. And you don't want to then rely on uranium supply from another state, politically speaking. So technically speaking, there's enough uranium in the world that you're never going to have a shortage. It's not the way the oil works. You use very little of it. For 100 years, you'd still use very little of it. So uranium supply is not a problem globally. but you don't want to become a recipient of uranium supply as an energy leader. There might be a prestige element to that, but also there might be a serious kind of capacity power element to there. If we have it, we want to use it. You'd have to look at their red book to see what their uranium quality is and whether it's market competitive. But I suspect that they don't care that whether it's market competitive. They care that it's good enough to use for fuel, to send to a fabricator for fuel for their reactors.
Thank you, Amna. Victor, do you want to comment?
Yeah, well, I think from Southeast Asia, I think it's on that front, looking at disarmament, non-proliferation, follows a similar kind of practice as in the Gulf. So what happens is all of us are NPT treaty members, not members, we signed the NPT treaty, all of the ASEAN members. In addition, we also have an ASEAN nuclear weapon free zone. We call it Bangkok Treaty. So that is like a regional framework in which we are looking at non-proliferation of nuclear weapon materials, right? And of course, in energy front, of course, ASEAN has always been trying to push for regional integration. For decades, we've been talking about trans-ASEAN gas pipelines. We've been talking about ASEAN power grid, in which we will be working closer as a region, instead of beyond individual countries. And in that, we can also make ourselves economically stronger when it comes to negotiating with export-import contracts, with our trade partners. So on that front, nuclear energy is really something that the region collectively is pushing for collaborations. So rather than looking at standalone projects, which is going to be a national decision anyway, the region is pushing towards a cooperation framework in which we will keep the members informed on the decisions. We will keep the neighbors informed about what their choice of the technology is, the choice of vendor, and also when they're going to have a nuclear plant, and also, the collective risks and benefits of having that plant. So this is, of course, on goodwill that we are hoping that region would adopt this practice in informing members and in going nuclear. But of course, several countries, in a way, made it clear that there will not be a reprocessing of nuclear fuel within the territory. This is simply because there is the issue of weaponizing, potentially being perceived as weaponizing plutonium. So reprocessing is probably not an option for the region. And then the question is, okay, so what are we going to really do with our fuel cycles, right? Is it going to be the case where we are doing a fuel leasing, meaning we take we invite people to build a plant, we take the fuel, and then when the fuel is burned, you take the fuel away, right? If there's a need to store the final radioactive waste after extracting plutonium in a nuclear weapon state, for example, Russia or China or anyone else, then maybe we deal with the less how should I call it, the less pro-weapon radioactive material, and we will do that in our own territory. But even then, the major issue is then how do we safeguard these radioactive material so they do not cause public harm as radiotoxic substance, in addition to proliferation. But as far as just looking at weaponizing, potentially weaponizing uranium or plutonium is concerned, the region follows the IAEA guidelines, and in fact, the countries invite regular reviews of the IAEA missions to make sure they are satisfied, or the IAEA is satisfied with the nuclear power program and the governance framework that's in place to ensure compliance with international practices, conventions, that we are not in any way weaponizing the nuclear materials that is already in the region. And of course, we have research reactors, right? It's not, we don't have any nuclear power reactor, but we have research reactor in the region. So there is transuranic waste from those research reactors. And also we have access to uranium, which, if you want to do it, you can actually make it into weapons. And so, of course, then the policy is that, well, right now, at least in the region, nobody is looking at enriching nuclear uranium. So there's no plan for building enrichment plant. And so in that sense, since we're not doing enrichment, we're not doing reprocessing, our fuel cycle would then be dependent on a partner country. right? So yes, there will be the potential security issues and risks associated with the supply of uranium. Now under the so-called international geopolitical development, there might be the issues about having sufficient access to HALEU, which is used in modern reactors, or using slightly higher enriched uranium for the more advanced small modular reactor that the industry is pushing. But at the end of the day, it is always a balancing between the kind of price, economic, and geopolitical risk exposed from fossil fuel supply chain versus that kind of risk that you're going to expose yourself from the uranium supply chain. Underneath that is the fundamentals of making sure all the materials, nuclear materials, are accountable, and they're not going into the directions that we don't want them to see. For example, end up in the in a weapon chamber, trying to make nuclear weapons based on a limited stock, right? So in terms of governance framework, legal and regulatory framework, they are already in place in the region. And the way I look at it is actually these are not barriers; these are actually enablers for the region to embark on a nuclear power program. I mean, if you look into Indonesia, you look into, for example, Vietnam, in some sense, Thailand, right? These are countries that are, I believe, are capable of embarking on an internationally credible nuclear power program, because they have the regulatory infrastructure in place from proliferation perspective, and also looking into procuring the right technology for the country and securing partnerships for the next 80 or 100 years, starting from where they have the reactors. So yes, I do see similarities in this regard. Also, maybe because the nuclear industry is a very special industry as compared to any traditional energy industry.
Thank you very much, Victor. Ludovica, would you like to comment? I can see that cooperation with the international organization like the International Atomic Energy Agency, the transparency and the accountability are the issues, and there's a discrepancy between the national strategy and the international controls. Do you want to add more to what Amna and Victor have said?
Yeah, I will jump on what Amna just said. So the problem has never been about countries' nuclear ambitions and plans. I mean, it's very important not to politicize these ambitions and plans. As long as countries submit to the NPT's verification, monitoring, and also safety framework and rules, there's nothing wrong with nuclear power. I mean, what does this mean? This means, of course, the IAEA's comprehensive safeguards agreements, and these are designed to, these are the first tool to deter diversion of nuclear material by increasing the risk of early detection. I think it's important to understand that nuclear safeguards are a means of reassurance because of the intrinsic dual-use dimension of nuclear power. So, and because of course, issues of trust and misperception, these safeguards are meant to reassure countries so that they could demonstrate to others that they're abiding to the peaceful commitments. So, I mean, the IAEA in this way works as a sort of mediator. So all NPT no weapon states must accept these full scope safeguards, which apply to all nuclear facilities in the countries. As Amna said, I mean, following the discovery of the Iraqi clandestine program, there was an additional tool that was introduced to strengthen and extend the classical safeguard system, and this is the model additional protocol, which I think entered into force around 1997. This was sort of a boost to the IAEA's ability to detect the undeclared nuclear activities, including those with no connection to the civilian fuel cycle. The additional protocol, of course, is a voluntary, as Amna said, agreement. So it must be agreed with no weapon states with the IAEA as a supplement to their existing comprehensive safeguard agreement. So in the case of, for example, Gulf states, not all of them have an additional protocol. Bahrain, Kuwait, and the UAE, they do have one in force. Oman, Qatar, and Saudi, they have not signed an additional protocol yet. Now, I think here it's important to also talk about the so-called small quantities protocol, because all Gulf states and I think a few states from Southeast Asia, they also are party to the small quantities protocol. So what it is, it's a protocol that was made available in the 70s to states with minimal or no nuclear material in facilities. So what does it do? It reduces the number of provisions of the comprehensive safeguard agreements that are held in abeyance, and the key provisions related to reporting nuclear material and the conduct of inspections that are operative. So, I mean, as I said, I mean, all Gulf states have the small quantities protocol in place, because, of course, they didn't have, of course, I mean, now the UAE doesn't have it anymore, because they, I mean, had minimal or no nuclear material or equipment. So, of course, there was recently a lot of debate about Saudi Arabia, because, of course, the nuclear plans and quite, I mean, big nuclear ambitions in terms of, you know, number of nuclear reactors and so on and so forth. So there's been a lot of pressure from the IAEA to ask Saudi Arabia to rescind from the small quantities protocol, because it has, countries must rescind themselves. So, I mean, it cannot be something that can be imposed. And of course, signed to the additional protocol. Why? Because that's just another tool, another instrument that could, of course, reassure and others about, of course, the peaceful intentions of a country. It's just the way it works. Yeah, so I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Ludovica. So we covered a lot of ground, and now I will try to, we have received some questions in the chat box, but if anyone have more questions, please feel free to type them down. Let me take this first question by Jathaniel Tin. The question is for Amna on what do you expect the final deal between Saudi Arabia and the US will look like. She highlights that, you know, Saudi Arabia like refrained from signing the 123 agreement, but at the same time, you know, the US is expected to be, the nuclear is expected to be part of the deal. And again, I already had actually a question from my side. So we see that in nuclear, you know, is yet another measure or a tool for great powers like China, the US, or maybe Russia to exert pressure on countries. But it's also at the same time, it's putting kind of like a pressure on the countries on how to balance their, you know, national interest and also balance their relationships with the great powers. So, so how do you expect the you know, the choices of the nuclear partnerships could affect the long-term geopolitical and the strategic national interest of the Gulf countries? And do you see differences between Saudi Arabia and the UAE?
Thank you, Aisha. Okay, so I guess I'll address the chat question first on what do I think the Saudi-US deal will look like. So I've gone on record multiple times doing this, and I'm not scared to do it again. I mean, I will believe that there is going to be a US-Saudi deal on nuclear when I see it. Just for a little bit of background, when I first joined the Global Security Director at Oak Ridge in 2015, I was like not even in graduate school then. Sorry, in 2015. The Saudis would be meeting with a US team to discuss a possible 123 agreement in the future, only to not find any kind of agreement, and you know, and the US would do the same. And I mean, these talks on the 123 agreement go back a lot longer than people realize. it's on people's radar now because now it's been, changed, and it's part of this larger comprehensive regional security agreement with the US and Saudi Arabia. And now there are other geopolitical dynamics like normalization with Israel and a defense pact and so on. And, Saudi Arabia kind of wanting to pursue a defense pact like that of Japan with the US, or the Asian countries with the US, like Korea. So it's gotten a lot bigger and wider now and includes a lot of other things beyond nuclear. There are scenarios that have been posited, such as the US allows Saudi Arabia to enrich, but that the US is the one on the ground doing the enrichment. That, the facility would be American, but it's beyond Saudi soil. Some people have posited that it would be American companies, enrichment companies, fabricators, and enrichment companies that and mining companies that would be on US soil, that would be on Saudi Arabian soil doing this for the Saudis. And therefore it would be Saudi American, but really it's, American. I don't see that this is going to happen. I don't see a way for the Saudi Arabia to ensure that the US won't renege. I think there was a lot of damage done by the US withdrawing from the JCPOA. And so for me, there's no way that Saudi Arabians can view the US as a credible, committed partner in the long term on this issue. Because all it takes is, Congress to change and withdraw it, a different US administration. This is a political deal. And so therefore, political dynamics in the US can keep changing and shifting, and so there's no way to secure it in the long term. To me, that's the biggest issue. It's not a matter of whether we can make the mechanics work. It's whether or not the mechanics would work for a year or 2 or 4 years and then change. That's the key issue here. And when you're talking nuclear, you're talking long term. You have to understand, especially the nuclear industry, it goes beyond the JCPOA, which was a political deal for a few years. A fuel cycle and all the industry involved in that. You're speaking, 10 to 20 years kind of commitment there. And if you can't, hold your partner as credible, then that's a problem. So now I'll move on to China and a couple of the other partners. The UAE went with Korea. When you go with Korea, because of Korea's relationship with the US and the nuclear technology it has received from the US, you're basically getting American technology for a much cheaper cost. And without the political complications that I just described, partnering with the US. So that's a very safe bet for states. France is another very safe bet because they're historically a very important nuclear provider of technology. And the only safeguards that they have are the ones that internationally are abided by. So IAEA safeguards, export control safeguards that are international. Unlike the US, they don't have a enrichment waiving mandatory kind of stipulation there. There's an export license that has to be renewed every few years, and that it is dependent on the state's position in terms of verification and monitoring. But as long as you're on good terms with the IAEA and nothing has been flagged, that shouldn't be a problem. So France is a very good option there. But the up-and-comer is China. China historically has been a nuclear recipient. It has not been a nuclear provider. Even China's technology is either, redesigned old US tech, French tech, or Russian tech. And they've kind of redone everything to make it their own. But the Chinese have become, very surprisingly, actually, only in the past few years, nuclear providers and attempting to build abroad. They've successfully built a pressurized water reactor in Pakistan. When it comes to high temperature gas reactors, they're doing some very cool stuff, actually. And it's very surprising. And it seems like, first of all, it's a political decision. The state seems to have empowered their nuclear industry to go forth. They also do it at cost or at a loss. Korea does this. So Korea did not make money off of the UAE deal. It just wanted to prove that it could export the technology. The UAE was the first case in which Korea exported their pressurized water reactor. China wanted to do the same. So it's now successfully exported its pressurized water reactor to Pakistan. It's not going to make money off of that. The goal isn't to make money. The goal is to strategic gain, right? To make sure there's now Chinese technology on the market in a competitive way. And they're succeeding at that. So Saudi Arabia went with the Chinese to do its geological surveys for uranium because they can do it cheap, they can do it quickly, and they have experience in that field. Did that raise eyebrows in the US? Yes, it did. Were there 1 million articles about this in the US saying, you know, Saudi Arabia is going with China, oh my God, proliferation, how can we do this? Saudi Arabia is a partner. We need to look at our relationships in the Middle East again. Yes, it did. And really to the Saudis' benefits. Because America does now understand with these cases that pivoting to Asia while leaving the Middle East behind is not a scenario you want. And there now is renewed focus on Saudi Arabia and the defense agreement and strengthening that. Bahrain is one that got a dividend out of that. They have a defense agreement now with the US, defense and economic one, the CISPA deal that happened last year. That includes a clause where the US says that it will come to Bahrain's defense. So yeah, I'll just leave it there then, you know, it is working, this kind of, you know, pushing partners against each other.
Thank you, Amna. On the same line, there is a question for you, Victor, also. Assuming that some Southeast Asian countries decide to invest in nuclear power station, where do you see the technology coming from? US, France, Japan, China? How realistic is it to believe that other countries will agree to sell or transfer technology to Southeast Asia?
Well, I think after hearing from Amna, I think we should do the exact same, you know. May the best country or the vendor with the best offering win in the Southeast Asia nuclear game, right? So I think really, you know, today, if let's say we rewind this back to the 60s and 70s, I think the answer would have been quite obvious, right? But today it is very different. We had the rise of Japan, the rise of Korea, and today the rise of China in all wanting to export the nuclear power technologies. And they all have their advantages and disadvantages in what they can offer. And of course, very often when it comes to nuclear, I always say this, you know, it's not about buying another power plant. You're not building a coal-fired power plant, not as simple as that. You're basically partnering with a country or a supplier that is going to stay with you for the next 100 years. That means industry, supply chains, components, expertise, governance, regulations, spend fuel, you know, whatever that's happening to the plant has something to do with your vendor, and you're going to stay with them. And the question is, how long can you stay with this partner that you're going to introduce into your country, not just the region, but into your country, right? And so then the challenge is, okay, so when we say, okay, may the best offer win. So what is the best offer, right? Does that mean build, own, operate, and then maybe eventually transfer? Or does that mean build and jointly own the asset, and then we could collectively benefit from the sales of electricity, and then we offer assurance on both sides on product off-taking and also the so-called radiation or spent fuel management? Or do we do the 100% financing model, meaning you do everything, we just promise you a proper pricing on the offtake, and maybe even we help you find a power purchase agreement off-taker for your plant, and you do whatever you need to do at the end of these 60 years, restore the place as if nothing has happened. You know, would that be a model that the region is going? I think right now is a big question mark. And of course, if you're looking at who are in the region, well, everybody is in the region. US is in the region, Russia, China, Japan, Korea, everybody is here. Because I think there is a collective recognition that this Southeast Asia will also be the next center of gravity for the next economic development, at least in the emerging, with all the emerging countries. And China and US now is really looking big time into Southeast Asia to try and establish a strategic presence in the region. And so does that mean it will be between China and Russia to offer a nuclear plant? Yes, they do have different offerings. And when it comes to US, then of course the international partnership and whatever vendors and equipment providers with the US that will come into the picture when it comes to project. China now today boasting 99% domestic manufacturing of all components. And yes, they have a track record in exporting, manufactured products to the world. They can do it at a price that is unreasonably low as compared to many other people. So question is, can China offer the same competitive package, not just a plant, the whole package as compared to US, where that is an international supply chain? China has its own strong supply chain. The same applies to Russia. It also has a very strong engineering supply chain for nuclear power, and it has as long a history as compared to the US. And also Russia is also a super mega builder of infrastructure. So putting your hands with these mega infrastructure builder in a way offers assurance of whatever that is around the plant, the nuclear plant, for example, the road, the bridge, the port facilities, right? So that's all part of the package. So it's very difficult to really nail down on one winner. And I think what would happen is different countries will eventually make a different choice, right? So right now, if you look at what's happening in Philippines, they're considering several countries. Indonesia is considering several countries. Vietnam, initially they wanted to go with the Russians, but after Fukushima, things seems to be changing. They also seem to be opening up to the other options, including startups. I mean, Vietnam is also in dialogue with companies that has never been in the nuclear business before, even countries that's not into nuclear, but now they have a startup. So that is also happening, in countries in Southeast Asia. And you also have a situation today, for example, NuScale, or even on that, I mean SMRs, right? I mean, if startups is able to offer SMRs as a product, then the countries are also able to look at the nuclear reactors of the future as a way of buying a product. And when that happens, if I have a robust domestic regulation to govern the safe use of nuclear energy, I could go with any vendor. I don't need to think about CGN. I don't need to think about Westinghouse, Rosatom. I can go with NuScale. I can go with USNC. I can go with, a company that offers a reactor that is approved by my competent regulator. So actually, that is also a potential scenario of the nuclear uptake in Southeast Asia going forward.
Thank you very much, Victor. Ludovica, do you want to comment on that? On the geopolitics and the interest and the partnerships?
Maybe just a quick, very, very quick comment on China. I think another element that it's quite interesting, on China as a partner in providing civil nuclear technology is the fact that the China model could have an appealing element due to its policy of non-interference, non-imposition regarding the nuclear fuel cycle independence. And that could be very appealing to some states. And then on the other side, and as Victor said, it's a relatively new player, so it benefits from the absence of negative experience in past, in past instances of non-proliferation disarmament. That's an important thing. The US, the US suffers from, previous experiences in its non-proliferation and arms control experience, which of course have and undermine its credibility and trust, as Anna said earlier. And then, again, China still needs to establish itself as a credible and reliable civil nuclear technology partner because of its new technology, because it's just new. It has to demonstrate its competitiveness against the leading suppliers. But again, there might be appealing elements that could be, really important for some countries.
Thank you, Ludovica. There is another question as in the human capacity. As mentioned by some of you, it takes long time to really develop the human capacity for nuclear. So the question is, for Amna, but also for everyone else here, So the Gulf countries are latecomers to the nuclear game. How the Gulf countries plan to enhance the human capacity, and what are the programs out there to leverage the human capacity needed to meet the nuclear ambitions? This is from Abdul Fattah, Middle East Council of Global Affairs.
Thank you for that question. Actually, I think I have some kind of different opinion on this in terms of capacity. So the UAE filled that capacity rather quickly, and it still is. I mean, it still has a little bit of way to go. But if it's a civilian nuclear program, because it takes so long to build these things, what the UAE did was it, created these partnerships with the operator and other states to kind of educate and train their people that are going to be in the sector as the construction was happening. And so once the first unit was ready, they actually did have some SROs ready, and they were training with the Koreans and with the operator. And anytime you pick a foreign operator, right, if you're not a nuclear, technology state itself, and you're importing that, you're going to be working with the operator for a number of years, and your engineers and everyone's going to be working with that operator for a few years. So I was very impressed with how the UAE did this and how fast they were able to kind of train people. And not that they didn't have any issues there. There was some competition with the oil sector at one point, kind of selling to the public that go be a nuclear engineer and, go work on the site, did have its ups and downs and did have its hurdles when there's a ready-made oil and gas sector that you can just plug into, right? So they did have to market it a bit, but they were very successful in doing so, and they're doing very well actually in building their capacity there. Saudi Arabia is a different case in that Saudi Arabia has engineers from the 80s. And they're actually very well trained, and a lot of them actually were trained in the US. They have American backgrounds or French backgrounds or Western backgrounds in terms of their education. Saudi Arabia actually has those, and they're amazing people, but they're also amazing at the fact that they've continued to train and do STEM teaching at Saudi Arabian universities. Saudi Arabia also understands that not everyone needs a degree in nuclear engineering. You can be an electric engineer and an industrial engineer and a systems engineer. A nuclear site doesn't need everyone to have a nuclear engineering degree. That's a very specific job at a nuclear facility, and you need everyone else actually there too, mechanical engineers and so on. And Saudi Arabia has a wealth of STEM graduates actually. They're also not interested in training everyone before operator has been chosen, right? So that's important to note that they haven't chosen a bidder. So they haven't partnered with anyone specifically on a long-term basis, because they haven't chosen a bidder. The UAE chose a bidder right away, so that was easy to do right away. There was a relationship with EDF, France, to train engineers for the summertime in France, and that happened for a few years. And there was also a program with South Korea to work on an SMR design. That's a very interesting relationship if you look at that. This smart reactor that Saudi Arabia and South Korea developed, they developed together. It wasn't just Saudi Arabia investment. There were scientists on both sides, scientists that were Saudi being trained by Koreans to help with this design. And really Saudi Arabia and South Korea jointly own that smart design. So again, there's a very unique difference there between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and that Saudi Arabia wants to have ownership of these things and build its own capacity in these things. The partnerships need to give Saudi Arabia something that is long-term in terms of capacity. And so that's the kind of the main difference there to me in terms of these things and these capacity building issues. I don't think they're far behind.
Thank you, Amna. I would like to hear your view, Victor, on how Southeast Asia is doing on the human capacity building in nuclear.
Yeah, well, I mean, nuclear energy has a long history. Although many people, although this is not really, high actively talked about, 5 countries, maybe 5, I think I counted correct, has nuclear research programs and those countries also have nuclear engineering programs. Countries like Vietnam, Thailand, they're also sending nuclear engineers to train in foreign nuclear power plants to get first-hand experience on how to operate the plant, the issues they would encounter. And some countries even go to the extent of acquiring a small stake in foreign nuclear power assets. That also allows for sharing of experience, transfer of knowledge and experience. So in terms of capacity building, Southeast Asia has also gone a long way in readying themselves towards a possible future of having nuclear power. But the question is, are we ready? Do we need to do more? I guess then that depends on which country, at what stage are we looking at. Between now until having the first plant, I think everybody still has a reasonable time frame that we're looking at. Some countries are more ambitious than others, but the earliest timeline that we're looking at is around 2035, maybe even further away. So there's a few years of training, but of course, if you're having a fresh start in training people, then time is running short and running out. So that means some countries in Southeast Asia would face a challenge, having nuclear power plant in time, even for 2050 timeline. Right? But most of us, the five that I mentioned, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines, these countries already have an existing nuclear research programs. They don't have an existing operating experience of a nuclear power plant, but they do have regular batch of people sent to foreign reactors for training in the hope of bringing them back when they have a plant. Yes, so on that front, yes, we are training one competent engineer scientist. But I think now the challenge is, do we have sufficient capacity or competence in the regulatory domain or in government, essentially having a competent regulatory team that can perform independent that can serve as independent regulators, reporting to directly the president or the prime minister on nuclear safety, security, and safeguards. So that remains a question mark, but that is something also all the regional countries are looking into. At least the front runner in nuclear energy, they are looking into this. Right? So there are countries like Indonesia, Malaysia already achieved the separation between the research entity and the regulator. The Philippines is doing it. Vietnam has also done that. So they're moving into the right direction, right? They need more time to have a really competent team of people, but we have the local educational infrastructure. We also have the international partners with foreign universities and also foreign regulators to exchange people in the regulatory domain. So I guess right now, at least, if you're looking into the general direction that we are moving in the right directions, and we are readying ourselves. So 2040, 2050 timeline seems to be feasible for for those that have a plan for nuclear.
Thank you very much, Victor. Ludovica, did you want to add any comments on the human capacity? Okay, so there's another question. I don't see further questions in the Q&A, but I have this question on, because my background is on climate change. In the COP28, 22 countries signed an agreement to triple the nuclear power by 2050. My question is, how feasible is this target is? You mentioned challenges like project delays, the cost, and then also maybe human capacity. So again, like, can countries achieve this target?
Well, I will take a bold answer. I think 9 out of 10 chances we're going to miss the target, right? Because which country can really build a fleet of nuclear reactors in the speed that we have seen in China in the 90s and even today? If yes, okay, we have another 10 countries that can do the same, well, maybe we'll be on track to meet that kind of target on nuclear reactors. If not, well, I guess we are probably going to miss the nuclear target, altogether. But that doesn't mean that there is not a chance. There's no meaning for the countries like in the Middle East or Southeast Asia to continue developing the nuclear fleet. from a climate change point of view, yes, nuclear energy is competing with renewables, whether we like it or not. There is a lot of debate about renewables complementing nuclear, but at the end of the day, they're all clean energies and they occupy a share of investment in the, in the national GDP or, by any investor portfolio. So they need to look after the returns on investment, and not everybody will invest in everything. And so they need to make a choice. And with nuclear, be that choice for them going forward is then again dependent on many, many factors, and geopolitics and politics are two of the major factors that they will be considering. So the thing is, do we need nuclear? Yes, we do. We need nuclear big time, but can we, deploy nuclear fast enough is a big question mark.
Thank you, Victor. Amna?
So I agree with Victor, but I do want to highlight, there's an asterisk on this. Because right now the UAE is the only Middle Eastern state with a civilian nuclear energy program. So to triple is a ratio. So when you're going from 0, it's actually really easy. There's still not a lot, there's really not a lot of nuclear there. So every new unit added has a much larger ratio, right? So I do think, the Egyptian reactors, when those are done, the Turkish reactors, those are well on their way. They actually have 2 more sites as well, Sinop and Thras. And then the Saudi reactors, that's a lot to flood. The Middle East for sure is going through a nuclear renaissance. I know it's a very hyperbolic term, and I don't know if that's happening globally, but for the Middle East itself, absolutely. You're literally going from 0 to, 4 countries adopting conventional, and then another 3 probably adopting SMRs when those that hit the market. It's a lot to add into the ratio there.
Thank you, Amna. Ludovica, do you want to comment?
Yeah, just a quick point on Europe, perhaps. We've seen, exactly what we've seen in East Asia after Fukushima. I think that the Russia-Ukraine war, will have strong impact on nuclear energy, on how nuclear energy is perceived at, both the high level, the governmental perception, but also the public perception. There are public surveys available, and in many European countries, the public perception decreased. Public appreciation of nuclear energy decreased a lot after the invasion of Ukraine, because of course the attacks on Zaporizhzhia, the attacks on Chernobyl. It's sort of reawakened all memories in Europe. I think it's fair to say that the Middle East is not the only region where attacks against nuclear facilities occurred in history. Europe is the first region in the world that has ever witnessed an attacks on nuclear facilities that happened in 1945 due to World War II. So the last instance of such happened in Ukraine, and this is quite there's a big variance between the global South and now, for example, Europe, on how nuclear energy is perceived. And Germany was the most prominent example of how decisions were promptly and quickly changed between phasing out nuclear totally, and then going back and reopening the carbon industry. And that was quite a reflection of how things are going in Europe. And I think this it's just another example of how different regions of the world are not on the same level and on the same pace when it comes to decarbonization.
Thank you very much, Ludovica, and thanks to Victor and Amna. We are coming to the end of this webinar today. We covered a lot of ground from different dimensions. I hope everyone has enjoyed the discussion today. And I would like also to thank everyone who have attended the webinar and the ones also who asked questions. With that, thanks again to the speakers, and thanks to everyone who joined, and have a good day.